Imagine a place where the wilderness reigns supreme, untamed, indifferent, and filled with secrets. Now imagine venturing there alone or with friends, armed only with a sense of adventure. Welcome to the mountains, a place of breathtaking beauty and, sometimes, bone-chilling terror. In the quiet of the forest, under the shadow of towering peaks, there's a fine line between awe and fear. The mountains have seen everything, and they hold their secrets close. What happens when we stumble upon something we were never meant to find? Grab your coffee, settle in, and prepare for 5 true tales of encounters that left those involved questioning their courage, their safety, and even their sanity. If you enjoy stories like these, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss our next chilling tale. And after you've listened, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had an unexplainable encounter in the wilderness? Or do you have your own theories about the strange happenings in the mountains? We'd love to hear them. Now, let's dive into the untamed wild, where beauty and terror go hand in hand. The Technician's Nightmare. Jacob Larson had always found peace in solitude. Working as a field technician for Rocky Mountain Communications meant long days on the road, miles from the nearest town, and hours spent in the quiet company of machinery and nature. For a man who thrived on routine and order, it was the perfect job. That was until the day he was sent to Relay Station 43. It started like any other assignment. His dispatcher, Linda, called early in the morning. "Station 43 is down," she said, her voice unusually tense. "The client's panicking. Says they need it up today." "Isn't that the one deep in San Juan National Forest?" Jacob asked, sipping his coffee. "Yeah, you'll have to take the service road off Route 145. It's pretty remote, but you've been out there before." He had once. The memory was vague, but he recalled the dense forest, the narrow road, and the eerie quiet that seemed to smother the area. "Got it," Jacob said, grabbing his keys. "I'll head out now." The drive was uneventful at first. The highway gave way to gravel roads, and the small towns grew farther apart until there was nothing but trees on either side of the road. Jacob hummed along to the radio, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. When he finally turned onto the service road, his GPS signal cut out. The truck jolted over the uneven path, and the towering pines seemed to close in around him. By the time the relay station came into view, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. The station was just as he remembered, a rusted metal structure surrounded by a chain-link fence. But something was off. The gate was open. Jacob frowned. The station was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest house. Who could have been here? He parked his truck and stepped out, grabbing his toolkit. The cold evening air bit at his skin as he approached the fence. The padlock hung loosely from the chain, unlatched but intact. "Maybe a maintenance guy forgot to lock up," he muttered, though the explanation felt hollow. Inside the fence, the station hummed faintly, its equipment blinking with error codes. Jacob set to work, trying to shake off the unease that crept up his spine. As he worked, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the hum of machinery and the occasional crunch of gravel beneath his boots. Then he noticed the footprints. Small, barefoot, and human, they circled the station in erratic patterns. Jacob stared at them, his pulse quickening. The footprints were fresh, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. He glanced at the tree-line, half expecting to see someone watching him, but the forest remained still. An hour passed, and Jacob was nearly done with the repairs when he heard it. A faint thud on the roof. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. Slowly, he turned off his tools and listened. The noise came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something scraping against metal. Grabbing his flashlight, Jacob stepped outside. The beam of light swept across the station, revealing nothing but the rusted walls and the empty clearing beyond. "Probably a branch," he muttered, though his voice trembled. As he turned to go back inside, he noticed something strange. His truck, parked just outside the gate, had moved. It hadn't rolled, he'd set the parking brake. But now it sat at an angle, as if someone had tried to push it. Jacob's throat tightened. He scanned the area, but the clearing was empty. Returning to the station, he worked as quickly as he could, his hands shaking. He wanted to finish and leave before the last light of day disappeared. By the time Jacob finished, the forest was shrouded in darkness. He packed up his tools, locked the station, and hurried toward his truck. That's when he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the moonlight. It was small and hunched, with pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Its head tilted to one side, as if studying him. "Hey!" Jacob called, though his voice cracked. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. Jacob climbed into his truck and locked the doors. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, the engine roaring to life on the third try. As he backed out of the clearing, his headlights swept across the figure. It was closer now, standing just outside the gate. Its face was wrong, elongated, with empty black eyes that seemed to bore into him. Jacob didn't wait to see what it would do. He floored the gas, the truck lurching onto the narrow dirt road. The road twisted and turned, the trees rushing past in a blur. Jacob's heart pounded as he glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was there, running after the truck. But it didn't move like a person. Its limbs bent unnaturally, its movements jerky and impossibly fast. Jacob gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. He pushed the truck to its limits, the engine groaning as it sped down the uneven path. When he finally reached the highway, the figure was gone. But the relief was short-lived. As he drove, the truck's radio crackled to life. Static filled the cab, followed by a faint voice. "You shouldn't have come." Jacob's blood ran cold. He yanked the radio's power cord, but the voice persisted, growing louder. "We warned you." The truck sputtered, its headlights flickering. Jacob slammed on the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a stop. For a moment there was silence. Then, in the glow of the flickering headlights, the figure appeared again. It stood in the middle of the road, its empty eyes locked on Jacob. Jacob didn't remember much of what happened next. He drove blindly, the road a blur as panic consumed him. When he finally reached the safety of a gas station on the outskirts of town, he stumbled out of the truck, his legs shaking. The attendant stared at him, wide-eyed. "You okay, man?" Jacob didn't answer. He just pointed to the truck. The attendant stepped outside, shining a flashlight on the vehicle. The truck was covered in small, child-sized handprints. The story concludes with Jacob quitting his job and leaving Colorado, but the nightmares never stop. To this day, he swears he hears whispers in the static of his radio and sees pale figures watching him from the shadows. The Moaning Mountains. Dr. Alan Whitaker adjusted his wide-brimmed hat against the sun and took a deep breath of the cool mountain air. The Andes stretched before him, jagged peaks rising like the spines of a slumbering beast. It was the kind of landscape that demanded respect, beautiful, remote, and unforgiving. The team had arrived 3 days ago to conduct a geological survey for a proposed hydroelectric dam. It was a project fraught with controversy. Local villagers claimed the mountains were sacred, that they harbored ancient spirits. Alan, ever the skeptic, dismissed the stories as folklore. "Alan, the seismometers are in place," called Nadia, his assistant, from a ridge above. Her voice echoed faintly, carried by the thin air. "Good. Let's get some baseline readings," Alan replied. Nadia and the rest of the team, Mark, the equipment specialist, and Carlos, their local guide, had been working tirelessly to set up the instruments. It was a challenging task, given the rugged terrain and unpredictable weather. "Think we'll be done on schedule?" Mark asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "If we don't run into any surprises," Alan said, a wry smile on his face. He had no idea how prophetic those words would be. The trouble began on the 4th day. The team was camped in a narrow valley, their tents pitched near a trickling stream. In the early hours of the morning, Alan woke to an unsettling sound. a low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. At first, he thought it was wind funneling through the peaks, but the sound was too deep, too resonant. "Did you hear that?" Nadia asked, poking her head out of her tent. "Yeah," Alan said, his voice low. Carlos emerged from his tent, his face pale. "It's the mountains," he said in Spanish. "They're warning us." Alan frowned. "It's just natural geology. Maybe a distant rockfall or tectonic movement." But even as he said it, he wasn't convinced. Later that day, while taking soil samples near the base of the valley, Mark stumbled upon something strange. "Alan, you need to see this," he called. Alan hurried over to find Mark kneeling beside a patch of earth that glistened unnaturally in the sunlight. A thick, black fluid oozed slowly from a crack in the ground, its surface shimmering like oil. "What the hell is that?" Alan muttered, crouching for a closer look. The fluid had an odd consistency, thicker than water but thinner than tar. It reeked of sulfur and decay. "I've never seen anything like this," Nadia said, wrinkling her nose. Carlos took a step back, crossing himself. "It's not natural," he whispered. "We shouldn't be here." Alan collected a sample, though every instinct told him to leave it alone. By the 5th day, the tremors began. They were faint at first, barely noticeable unless you were standing still. But as the hours passed, they grew stronger, rattling the equipment and sending loose rocks tumbling down the slopes. "Seismic activity wasn't in the forecast," Alan said, staring at the data on his tablet. "It's not localized," Nadia pointed out. "Look at the pattern. It's like something's moving underneath us." The moaning sounds returned that evening, louder and more insistent. They reverberated through the valley, making the ground feel alive. Carlos refused to leave his tent. "The mountains are angry," he said. "We need to go." Alan, ever the pragmatist, insisted they stay. "We've got a job to do," he said, though his resolve was beginning to waver. The next day brought disaster. The team was scaling a ridge to set up a final seismometer when the ground beneath them began to quake violently. "Get down!" Alan shouted as the tremors intensified. The roar of the landslide was deafening. Rocks and debris cascaded down the mountainside, narrowly missing the team as they scrambled for cover. When the dust settled, they were trapped. The path back to their camp was buried under tons of rubble. "Is everyone okay?" Alan called, his voice hoarse. "We're fine," Nadia replied, coughing. "But we're not getting back that way." Carlos pointed to the sky, his face stricken. "Look!" High above them, on the peak of the nearest mountain, a dark shape loomed. At first, Alan thought it was a shadow, but it moved, slowly, deliberately. "What is that?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. No one had an answer. With their camp inaccessible and their supplies running low, the team had no choice but to descend the mountain by an alternate route. The black fluid appeared again, seeping from cracks in the ground and pooling in unnatural formations. It seemed to pulse, as if alive. The moaning sounds grew louder, and the tremors became almost constant. "Alan, this isn't normal," Nadia said. "We need to call for help." "We're out of range," Alan replied, holding up his satellite phone. "We need to get to higher ground." As they climbed, the mountains seemed to fight them at every turn. Rockfalls blocked their path, and the air grew thick with an acrid sulfuric smell. And always the dark shape loomed above them, watching. That night, huddled in a makeshift shelter, Alan had a chilling realization. The tremors, the fluid, the moaning, they weren't random. They were deliberate. The mountains were alive. "They're not just formations," he said aloud. "They're something else. Something sentient." Nadia and Mark stared at him, their faces pale. Carlos nodded. "The villagers were right," he said. "These mountains are sacred, and we've angered them." The team's final descent was a race against time. The tremors were now violent enough to topple trees and split the ground. The black fluid flowed freely, forming streams that hissed and bubbled. As they reached the base of the mountain, the dark shape descended. It moved like a shadow, flowing over the landscape with an unnatural grace. "Run!" Alan shouted, though his legs felt like lead. They reached the road just as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds. Behind them, the mountains roared, a deep, mournful sound that shook the very earth. When they finally reached the safety of their vehicle, Alan turned for one last look. The dark shape stood at the edge of the forest, watching. Weeks later, Alan sat in his office, staring at the black fluid sample under a microscope. It defied analysis, its properties unlike anything found on Earth. He thought about the mountains, the moaning, the dark shape. Some places, he realized, were never meant to be disturbed, and the mountains would ensure no one ever forgot that. The honeymooners' hiking trip. For Aaron and Lucas Miller, their honeymoon wasn't about beaches and cocktails, but adventure. They had met during a rock climbing session, bonded over their shared love for the outdoors, and now, weeks after their wedding, they wanted to celebrate their union surrounded by nature's untouched beauty. "Are you sure about this trail?" Lucas asked as Aaron spread a detailed map of the Cascades across the hood of their SUV. "Of course," Aaron replied, grinning. "It's a popular route, with incredible views and just enough challenge to make it interesting. It's remote, though," Lucas pointed out, glancing at the dense line of trees framing the dirt road where they'd parked. "I'm all for adventure, but you remember the guide warned us about bears." "Bears? Schmares," Aaron teased. "That's why we have this." She patted the bear spray clipped to her backpack. "Besides, we're with a group. Safety in numbers, right?" Their group consisted of 4 other hikers, Kate and Travis, a seasoned trekking duo from Portland, and Tanya and Greg, a couple from Texas who were relatively new to the outdoors. They had all met at the trailhead and decided to hike together after realizing they'd planned similar routes. The first day of the hike was idyllic. Towering pines whispered in the breeze, and the trail wound through sun-dappled clearings and past crystal-clear streams. The group's laughter and chatter filled the air as they got to know each other. "You two newlyweds really know how to honeymoon," Kate said, adjusting her hiking poles. "Travis and I did something similar a few years back. But trust me, the woods test your patience." "Oh, Lucas already passed the patience test with my family at the wedding," Aaron joked. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, they found a suitable clearing to set up camp. The evening was spent around a small fire, sharing stories and marshmallows. It was perfect until the night began to stir. Lucas woke first just before dawn. He wasn't sure what had roused him, but something felt off. The forest, usually alive with the chirps of crickets and the rustle of leaves, was eerily silent. He unzipped the tent quietly, careful not to wake Aaron, and stepped out into the chilly morning air. The embers of last night's fire glowed faintly, casting long shadows across the campsite. That's when he saw it. Just beyond the perimeter of their camp, pressed into the soft earth, was a massive footprint. It was human-like but impossibly large, at least twice the size of his own foot. "Lucas!" Aaron's voice broke the silence, startling him. He turned to see her standing at the entrance of the tent, her face etched with concern. "Come look at this," he said, motioning her over. "What the—" Aaron trailed off, crouching to examine the print. "It's huge. Did someone wander into our camp without waking anyone?" "And barefoot," Lucas countered. By now, the others were stirring. Kate and Travis joined them first, followed by Tanya and Greg. The group gathered around the footprint, their initial grogginess giving way to unease. "Could be a prank," Travis suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Who'd be out here doing this?" Tanya asked, glancing nervously at the dark woods. No one had an answer. As the group continued their hike that day, the atmosphere shifted. The cheerful camaraderie of the previous day was replaced by an undercurrent of tension. The forest, too, seemed different, quieter, darker, as if the trees themselves were watching. Even the birdsong had vanished. "Does anyone else feel like we're being followed?" Tanya whispered to Aaron as they climbed a steep incline. Aaron nodded but didn't say anything. She had felt it too, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, as though unseen eyes were tracking their every move. When they stopped for lunch, Lucas decided to lighten the mood. Okay, let's talk theories. What made the footprint? Bigfoot? A bear with freakishly long toes? Definitely Bigfoot, Travis said with a grin, though it didn't reach his eyes. Whatever it is, I just hope it's far away, Greg muttered, scanning the treeline. That night, Erin woke to a low rustling sound outside the tent. She held her breath, straining to listen. Lucas, she whispered, shaking him awake. What is it? He murmured, still half asleep. Listen. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by a faint thumping, as if something heavy was moving through the underbrush. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the night, followed by a chorus of snapping branches. Erin and Lucas froze. Then they saw them. Two glowing eyes, yellow and unblinking, peering at them through the trees. Oh my God! Erin whispered, her voice trembling. The eyes disappeared as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving the couple paralyzed with fear. Morning brought no relief. The group found another massive footprint near their camp, this one fresher and deeper. I think we should turn back, Tanya said, her voice trembling. We're too far in, Travis argued. It'll take just as long to backtrack as it will to finish the loop. Then we stick together, Lucas said firmly. No splitting up, no wandering off. As they hiked, the forest seemed to close in around them. Shadows stretched longer, and the air grew heavy, oppressive. By late afternoon, they spotted it. A towering figure, partially obscured by the trees, stood at the edge of a clearing. Its silhouette was unmistakably humanoid but grotesquely oversized, with broad shoulders and limbs that seemed too long. The figure turned its head, and for a brief moment, they saw its face, a distorted, almost human visage with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Run! Someone shouted, breaking the spell. Panic set in as the group fled, the underbrush tearing at their clothes and slowing their progress. Behind them, the sound of snapping branches grew louder, closer. Lucas grabbed Erin's hand, pulling her along. Keep moving! They stumbled upon a narrow ravine and scrambled down, hoping to lose their pursuer. The descent was treacherous, but adrenaline fueled their movements. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, the forest was silent once more. Did we lose it? Kate whispered, her voice barely audible. No one answered. As dusk fell, the group set up a hasty camp in a densely wooded area. No one wanted to risk another night in the open. Erin and Lucas huddled together, their nerves frayed. If we make it out of this, we're never hiking again, Erin whispered, forcing a weak smile. Lucas nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the image of the towering figure, or the sense that it wasn't finished with them. Around midnight, the silence was broken by a low, guttural growl. The creature emerged from the shadows, its massive form illuminated by the flickering campfire. It was closer now, its features grotesque and primal. The group froze, paralyzed by fear. Then, with a deafening roar, the creature lunged. In the chaos that followed, the group scattered, their screams echoing through the forest. Lucas and Erin ran blindly, their only goal to survive. Somehow, they found the trailhead just as dawn broke, their clothes torn and their faces streaked with dirt and tears. The others weren't so lucky. Epilogue, the legend lives on. Weeks later, back in the safety of their suburban home, Erin and Lucas tried to put the ordeal behind them, but the memories lingered, haunting, vivid, and unexplainable. Late one night, as Erin scrolled through forums about cryptids, she stumbled upon a post about the Cascades. Bigfoot, she murmured, though she wasn't convinced. Whatever they had encountered wasn't just a legend. It was real, and it was still out there. The Night Shift Encounter. Jeff Carson had worked countless night shifts in his 7 years as a security officer, but none had ever been as unsettling as those at the Ridgeway Research Facility. Nestled deep in the desolate woods of northern Minnesota, The facility was a cluster of gray, windowless buildings surrounded by tall fences topped with razor wire. "What do they even do here?" Jeff had asked his supervisor during orientation. "Classified stuff," his boss had said with a shrug. "Just keep the place secure and don't ask too many questions." That night, as Jeff settled into the small, dimly lit security booth near the entrance gate, the silence felt heavier than usual. The surrounding forest was pitch black, the kind of darkness that made you feel like the world ended just beyond the beam of your flashlight. Jeff sipped his lukewarm coffee and glanced at the monitors showing grainy feeds of the perimeter. Nothing out of the ordinary, just empty lots and the occasional rustle of wind. He sighed, settling in for another long, uneventful shift. It was around 2 a.m. when Jeff first noticed it. One of the monitors flickered, static briefly obscuring the feed. When the image returned, his brow furrowed. The feed from camera 7, which covered a rarely used back-end trance, seemed darker than usual. Jeff leaned forward, adjusting the brightness. That's when he saw the shadow. At first, it was just a faint shape, barely discernible against the darkness. But as he watched, it moved, a jerky, unnatural motion, like something trying to mimic human movements but failing. "Probably a deer," Jeff muttered to himself, though his voice wavered. He grabbed the flashlight and his radio, stepping out into the cold night air. The gravel crunched under Jeff's boots as he approached the back gate. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the chain-link fence and the dense woods beyond. "Security check," he called out, his voice sounding small in the vast silence. No response. Then he heard it, a faint rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. "Hello," Jeff called, his flashlight darting from tree to tree. The footsteps stopped. Jeff's pulse quickened. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, its beam trembling slightly. He took a cautious step forward. That's when he saw it. Emerging from the shadows was a figure unlike anything Jeff had ever seen. It stood unnaturally tall, its wiry limbs bent at odd angles. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over elongated bones, giving it a gaunt, almost skeletal appearance. But the worst was its neck. It was grotesquely long, extending far beyond what was humanly possible, and it craned its head to look at Jeff with cold, black eyes. Jeff froze, his breath caught in his throat. The creature tilted its head, studying him with an eerie curiosity. Then it moved. In a fluid, almost serpentine motion, it darted forward, closing the distance between them in seconds. Jeff stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. "Stay back!" he shouted, fumbling for the radio on his belt. The creature stopped just short of the fence, its spindly fingers wrapping around the chain links. Its head tilted again, and for a horrifying moment, Jeff thought it might try to speak. Instead, it let out a low, guttural growl. Jeff didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran, his boots slipping on the gravel as he sprinted back toward the security booth. Behind him, he heard the clattering of metal as the creature climbed the fence with inhuman speed. He burst into the booth, slamming the door shut and locking it. His hands shook as he grabbed the phone, frantically dialing his supervisor's number. The line rang and rang, but no one picked up. Jeff glanced at the monitors. Camera 7 was now completely static, but on camera 3, the one closest to the booth, he saw the creature. It stood just outside, its elongated neck craned to peer into the camera, as if it knew he was watching. Jeff's breath hitched. He grabbed his car keys and bolted for the patrol vehicle parked nearby. The engine roared to life, and Jeff threw the car into gear, speeding down the narrow access road that wound through the facility. In the rearview mirror, he saw the creature emerging from the shadows, running after him with terrifying speed. Its long limbs moved with an unnatural grace, its neck craning side to side as it chased him. Jeff floored the accelerator, the car bouncing over potholes and uneven ground. The creature was gaining, its grotesque form illuminated by the red glow of the taillights. Just as it seemed like it might catch him, the patrol car hit a bend in the road, and Jeff lost sight of it. Jeff didn't stop driving until he reached the nearest town, a good 30 miles from the facility. He parked outside a diner, his hands still trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. He sat there for what felt like hours, his mind replaying the events of the night. Eventually, he gathered the courage to glance in the rearview mirror. For a moment, his heart stopped. In the faint reflection, he thought he saw those cold, black eyes staring back at him. The next day, Jeff's supervisor called him in. "You abandoned your post," the man said, his tone accusatory. "There was something out there," Jeff insisted. "Something not human." The supervisor sighed, shaking his head. "We reviewed the footage. All we saw was static." Jeff stared at him in disbelief. "That thing was real. I saw it. It chased me." The supervisor dismissed him with a wave. "Get some rest, Carson. Maybe take a few days off." Jeff quit the job that same day. But even years later, he couldn't escape the memory of the creature, or the lingering suspicion that it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. The final warning. The mountains were Eli's sanctuary. After months of stressful shifts at his IT job, he craved solitude, the kind only nature could provide. His destination, an isolated spot in the Sierra Nevadas, far from crowded trails and buzzing phones. He had planned meticulously, a sturdy tent, enough provisions for a week, and a map marking the lesser-known paths. The locals called the area Dead Echo Valley, a name Eli found intriguing. "They say you can hear things there," the gas station clerk had said as Eli stocked up on supplies. "Voices, cries, strange stuff." Eli had chuckled. Probably just the wind. But now, as he parked his car at the trailhead and looked up at the jagged peaks shrouded in mist, a faint unease stirred in his chest. The first night was uneventful. Eli set up his tent near a crystal-clear stream and fell asleep to the soothing sound of water rushing over rocks. The second night, however, was different. Eli was stirring his campfire stew when he heard it, a distant cry echoing through the trees. It was faint, almost like the wail of an animal, but there was something off about it. He froze, listening intently. The cry came again, louder this time. "Probably a coyote," Eli muttered, though the sound didn't quite match. As the hours dragged on, the cries continued, growing closer. By midnight, Eli's unease had turned to dread. The next morning, Eli decided to investigate. Equipped with a flashlight, a knife, and a healthy dose of skepticism, he followed the sound of the cries, which had resumed at dawn. About a mile from his campsite, he stumbled upon a clearing. In its center was an old campsite. A weathered tent collapsed in on itself, a rusted kettle hanging over a long-dead fire pit, and scattered belongings half-buried in dirt. Something about the scene felt wrong. The tent wasn't just abandoned. It looked as though someone had left in a hurry. Scratches marred the fabric, and deep gouges scarred the nearby trees. Eli knelt to examine a tattered backpack when he noticed something else. The ground was littered with bones. Some were small, likely from animals, but others were disturbingly large. That night, the cries returned, louder and more insistent. Eli sat by his fire, gripping his knife as the sound circled his campsite. Then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the cries stopped. The silence was oppressive, pressing in from all sides. Eli's eyes darted to the shadows beyond the firelight. A branch snapped and Eli whipped around. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. No response. Then he saw it. A pair of glowing eyes watching him from the darkness. They were unnaturally high off the ground, easily 8 or 9 feet. Eli's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped closer. The thing that emerged from the shadows defied logic. Its body was emaciated, its skin stretched taut over sharp bones. Long, sinewy limbs dangled at odd angles, and its face was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and a mouth that seemed too wide. It stared at Eli, unblinking, its glowing eyes filled with an intelligence that felt disturbingly human. Eli slowly backed away, clutching his knife. "Stay back," he whispered, though he doubted the creature understood him. The thing tilted its head, as if considering him. Then it let out a cry, a long, mournful wail that seemed to vibrate through Eli's very bones. It was the same cry he had been hearing for 2 days. Eli ran. He didn't stop to grab his gear, didn't look back to see if the creature was following. His only thought was to put as much distance between himself and that thing as possible. The cries pursued him, growing louder and more frantic. He tripped and fell, scraping his hands and knees on the rocky terrain, but he forced himself to get up. The trail twisted and turned, disorienting him. He wasn't sure how far he had gone when he saw it again, those glowing eyes staring at him from the trail ahead. The creature had circled him. Desperate, Eli scrambled off the trail, plunging into the thick underbrush. Thorns tore at his skin, and branches slapped his face, but he didn't care. He just had to get away. The cries were everywhere now, echoing from all directions. It was as if the forest itself was alive, mocking him. Finally, Eli stumbled into a clearing and collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. For a moment there was silence. Then he saw it. Carved into the trunk of a massive tree was a single word: leave. The bark around the letters was blackened and charred, as if burned into the wood. Eli didn't need another warning. By the time Eli reached his car, the sun was rising. He didn't stop to catch his breath or look back. He just jumped in, started the engine, and sped away. As he drove, the cries faded, replaced by the hum of the engine and the thudding of his heart. But even as the miles stretched between him and Dead Echo Valley, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Back in town, Eli reported what he had seen to the local ranger station. The officer listened patiently but offered little more than a skeptical nod. Dead Echo Valley's been off limits for years, the ranger said. Too dangerous. Landslides, predators, strange stories. What about the cries? Eli asked. The ranger hesitated, then leaned in closer. Not all cries in the wilderness are meant to be heard, he said softly. Eli left the station, vowing never to return to the mountains. But on quiet nights, when the wind howled through the trees, he could still hear it, that mournful, otherworldly cry echoing in his mind. And he would always wonder, was it a warning or a summons? Closing reflection. The mountains, ancient and enigmatic, have always stood as silent witnesses to the passage of time. They tower above us, their peaks shrouded in mist, their valleys whispering secrets we may never fully understand. For centuries, they've inspired awe, adventure, and reverence. But they've also reminded us of our fragility. The tales you've heard tonight are more than just stories of fear and the supernatural. They are cautionary whispers from the wilderness itself. They urge us to tread carefully, to honor the boundaries between what is known and what is meant to remain unknown. For in the heart of the mountains, the rules of the world as we know them often bend. What we dismiss as mere myths or superstitions may, in fact, be fragments of truths too wild to accept. And for every echoing cry or unsettling encounter, there lies a lesson, a reminder to respect the untamed. So, as you reflect on these chilling accounts, ask yourself, how well do you know the world beyond your doorstep? How many secrets lie just beyond the tree line, hidden in the shadows of the peaks? The mountains are more than landscapes. They are keepers of mysteries. And while they may tempt us to explore, not every path is meant to be walked, not every sound is meant to be followed, and not every secret is ours to uncover. If these stories left you with chills, let them also leave you with respect. For every mountain holds its own tales, and some are better left undiscovered.